Hi, everybody. This is the second lecture for week two. Again, a reminder, Journal 2, Discussion Board 2 are due this weekend by Sunday. So one of the things you're going to want to do is, of course, read Gorn and Goldstein, as it says on our course outline here, but also look at those Blackboard readings for the saints and their bodies specifically, and the betting in games. In the colonial world, saints and their bodies are about, it was written in the 1850s, a very different time from the colonial period. But these are definitely going to help you prepare for Journal 2 and Discussion Board 2. Um, so what I want to talk about in this quick lecture is just to give a quick idea of what's going on in the larger community, larger society in terms of this idea that we have here called muscular Christianity that's dealt with in Gordon and Goldstein. So Gordon and Goldstein go into this a great depth, but I think one of the things that we need to realize is that the American Revolution, of course, was a absolutely radical change in terms of American society of what had come before. We all, of course, have a sense of this in regards to our notions that America as a nation, in all of its positives and all of its flaws, often are associated with what happens with those founders in the American Revolution. The positive of the Declaration of Independence and these ideas of individual rights that are part of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, but then at the same time, of course, that absolutely paradoxical situation in which, of course, these things are only open to certain people. What we can see in terms of the first 100 years or so of the Republic after the founding of the United States is a struggle in which you have a situation where different groups are coming to the fore and asking and calling and begging and fighting for equality, for the things that seem to be promised in the Declaration of Independence. There's no question that when the founders put together these documents, that they did not intend these to be universal for all human beings living in the United States. There was some sense of it from some of the most radical founders that this should be something that would be open at least to all men, but almost none are going to be pointing to women and saying this is a possibility for them. What happens after the revolution then are oftentimes very radical moments in which different groups are calling for reform and perhaps even new types of revolution that are going to, in their minds, finish what the founders had started. One of the really incredibly important social issues that are happening in the social changes that are happening in the United States during this time period in the first 30, 40 years after the revolution is what's sometimes called the Second Great Awakening. The first Great Awakening took place in the pre-revolutionary era. The Second Great Awakening takes place usually associated starting in the 1810s, perhaps 1820s, and lasting at least up until the 1840s and 1850s. The Great Awakening is a very loose term for basically a religious revival in the United States. Many of the founders were really not very religious people. They were oftentimes not considered to be traditional Christians. A number of them were more Enlightenment era philosophical dice, as they were called, believers in kind of a God that's very hands off. The Great Awakening is this different type of religious upheaval that really spreads starting in areas like New York and Western Ohio and spreads really throughout most of the nation throughout the era of the 1820s, 30s, and 40s. And to put it simply, as we can see from this image here, the Great Awakening is all about emotion. It's all about the emotion of spirituality, of religion. It is not cold, calculated, rational notions of a clockmaker God. It's the idea that miracles exist, in terms of fire and brimstone preaching from people who perhaps are coming up from the crowd, not well trained ministers. And so what you can see in this image from the Great Awakening, a lot of times these are outside. They are rallies that are not made for churches. They are made for places in which people are outside, fresh air, huge groups. People are falling down on their knees. They are crying. They are screaming. They are dancing. They are singing. It's all about this kind of sense of emotion. The obsession with the Great Awakening is the idea that there is sin. There is sin in everybody. There is sin in society at large. And just like you should want to try to get rid of sin out of the individual, you should try to want to get it out of society at large. So those who come out of the Great Awakening often become reformers. They become reformers of society. They want to change the sins of society. They want to fix the sins of society. So most famously where this takes place is in the temperance realm. Temperance in the United States starts in the 1820s and 30s as huge numbers of Americans drink an enormous amount of alcohol. The idea is that this movement will basically help fix individuals, and in so doing will help fix society. Alcohol was associated with violence and promiscuous sex and suicide and people losing their jobs and not taking care of their families. The idea is you get rid of this, you deal with this issue, and all of these other social issues will fall into line. This is, of course, a very famous aspect of American tradition that goes really even all the way to our present day. We, of course, had a constitutional amendment in the 1919 and 1920s that was, of course, prohibition that made alcohol something people could not get their hands on. Temperance is just one. There was an anti-slavery movement, there was anti-prostitution movements, anti-gambling movements, these things that are trying to help society. Well, one of the obsessions was if you're trying to better society, and in so doing, of course, getting rid of your own sin, the obsession was oftentimes this notion that your body was very much a temple, right? You don't take alcohol in, not just because it's going to hurt society, but because, of course, it's going to hurt your health. And so to be healthy, to be in good shape, to take care of yourself, to be strong was seen as being something that was doing good for God and for religion. And so you get this very interesting situation in which you have, at the same time the Great Awakening is occurring, many of these people become what you might call health food nuts, to put it simply. They're people who are obsessed with finding the perfect diet, that they think that this, perhaps, if people would eat this, then all of these other issues would come into line, right? It would be, obviously, you get rid of alcohol, but perhaps you want to eat whole grains and do this, and it's going to make everything better. Your whole body will become more healthy, and hence you'll be able to work for God better. One person who actually has an effect still today in terms of his name is Sylvester Graham, who is a doctor who is obsessed with finding this perfect food, and very famously, he invents the graham cracker. The graham cracker, which is not like really the graham cracker of today. If you've ever eaten graham crackers, they're of course sweet and more like a cookie than a cracker. In many ways, the graham cracker at that point in time for Sylvester Graham, the idea was really this is the only food you would really need. This would be the basis of your diet, and everything would fall into line in terms of your health, and hence then you would become a better Christian because your body would be. It would be just like your spirit. They would line up together, and sin would be destroyed as you ate better food. This is the situation that is really spreading throughout the country for a lot of these reformers. They're looking for, in many ways, perfection of the individual, perfection of society. Of course, what this has a part to play in is this leads to a great deal of political upheaval because many of these people, as I mentioned, they also become concerned with issues such as slavery. The temperance movement, the health food movement were all tied together, and the Great Awakening were all tied together with the abolitionist movement. The notion, of course, that perhaps the biggest sin the nation has is the sin of slavery, which is based upon violence, it's based upon sexual exploitation, and it is something that needs to be done away with. So, What of course comes about with this is you start to see a wedge being drawn in the United States. Of course, this starts to be associated with slavery more than any other, and slavery will become the driving factor to the Civil War. But what you had for the reading in terms of the saintly bodies, the reading that you're looking at from 1852, saints and their bodies, is this notion that again, to be a strong person is to be, in terms of physically strong, is to be spiritually strong, and these things will lead to a stronger nation. Uh, Not surprisingly, the person who wrote that work was also a highly decorated, he would become a highly decorated, um, uh, he was a very famous preacher, Thomas Wentworth Higginson. He was a very famous preacher from Boston, from Massachusetts. He was from this old family in the Far East. He would become a couple of things. One, of course, he was a writer before the war and his preacher, a minister, but he also, of course, as soon as the war started, he became a Civil War officer. He would become the colonel of a regiment of African American soldiers that he would write about his experiences on. He was a radical abolitionist. Thomas Wentworth Higginson would be one of the supporters of John Brown, giving John Brown money and goods for weapons. John Brown is the radical abolitionist who tries to overthrow the slave system in Virginia by attacking Harper's Ferry and starting a slave uprising in 1859, which is usually seen as being this kind of first moment of the Civil War. That's what Wentworth Higginson is. So what we get is all of these things coming together. Now, as we're going to see in our further discussions, at this point during this time period of the early republic, sports is still something that is it is about people's leisure time. It is not something that is a big part of necessarily a larger mass society. Really, that comes about in the post-Civil War era because the United States and its civilization and its culture really starts to change at that point in time. It takes the Civil War, though, to start to become a more democratic nation, of course. What you get is a situation in which the deadliest war in American history is fought eventually, of course, not initially, but eventually, to end slavery and leading to the freedom of 4 million people who had been enslaved with the notion that slavery will no longer exist in the United States. Now, we will talk about race later on, which, of course, there are different methods that are taken by the white supremacist system to basically enslave African Americans by other means. We'll talk about that as we move along in the terms of sports. But what you get with the Civil War is this moment of a democratic revolution, what a lot of people have called the Second American Revolution. And so what we're going to see is in this post-Civil War era, American society is changing. The American world is very much changing, and in many ways, the Civil War is this breaking point from this early era of the Republic to a more modern, recognizable America. So that's what we'll talk about more next time. Remember, Journal 2, Discussion Board 2 this weekend, and I'll see you soon.